Well, for cardiology news, we begin with two studies on atrial fibrillation, and first off is one looking at a new device to prevent sudden cardiac death. This was a registry study published in JACC of 8,450 patients who wore a wearable cardioverter defibrillator in the early period post-MI when an ICD is not yet indicated. And so they looked for the incidence of ventricular arrhythmias and indeed sudden death. And they found overall that 1.6% of patients had an appropriate shock, and of those 91% were resuscitated successfully. So 1.4% of people were then saved by wearing this device. They found that the highest risk patients were those with an EF less than 30% when measured early post-MI. And so that may be a high-risk group where use of this device could be useful in more broad adoption in clinical practice. Next up, we have a paper that looked at air pollution and the risk of atrial fibrillation. So colleague Mark Link at Tufts, who did a very detailed measures on 176 patients, in whom about 50 had episodes of atrial fibrillation, a total of 328 episodes. And he correlated it with various different measures of air pollution and found that this acute exposure to air pollution was one of the strongest correlates of development of atrial fibrillation. And so this identifies really a new risk of air pollution and potentially may underlie some of the overall increased cardiovascular risk that's been seen with air pollution as well. And the top pick this week is another analysis from the AVERROES trial that looked at one of the novel anticoagulants, Apixaban versus aspirin, in patients with atrial fibrillation who were deemed unable or unwilling to take warfarin anticoagulation. As you know, the overall trial showed about a 50% reduction in stroke without an increase in bleeding. And this analysis looked at rehospitalization and found a 20% reduction in cardiovascular rehospitalization, so an added benefit over and above that which had been seen before. And indeed, prevention of cardiovascular rehospitalization was seen to be important. This was the strongest correlate of subsequent mortality and thus an early read on those high-risk events. And so an added benefit of the novel anticoagulant in patients with atrial fibrillation. So for this week's news, I'm Chris Cannon.